Hi there, everyone, and welcome to our next in a series of work in progress seminars. We normally do these in person over some lovely lunch, but we're doing them over Zoom instead. Maybe I could just say a little bit about what the plan is for the next almost an hour. Yes, Robert, sorry, there's no lunch. We've got two teams that are working in different ways with mapping projects. We're going to start off with Yanos on MAPHIS, and then after that we're going to turn to Laurence and Liz and Anne-Laure, who are going to talk a bit about a project on flood mapping and flood modelling. And then what we'll have is a chance at the end for kind of conversation amongst the whole team as well. But we'll make sure we take a break after each presentation, just if there's any specific questions that come up with that. So Yanos, maybe over to you. What would be great is, could you introduce us a little bit to the project? You might want to say a bit about the bigger project team. I know there's just you representing, but there's a bigger project team, some of whom I see from chat are also with us. So maybe you could introduce the project team, but also just give us a sense of what the project is about, what the main research questions are.
Okay. So yeah, very nice to meet you all. So if you don't mind, I would like to share some slides to do that for two reasons. First, because those are maps, so it works quite well to share slides. But also, then I would appear very small, like to you, and you wouldn't be able to see my haircut. Give me 1 second.
Or lack of haircut.
Yeah, or lack of, but not lack of hair, unfortunately. Okay. So let me let me introduce you the project then. So the idea of the project is to use machine learning in order to understand city development. And basically the idea is to digitize historical maps and collect other type of data in order to give some sense of how cities developed in the long run. And for the project, we would like to apply this to Bristol and to combine this data with oral testimonies, especially about 3 neighborhoods of Bristol. And if possible, to try to think about creating an interactive map that would combine objective data with this more subjective or oral testimonies. So this is the idea of the general project. And so first, let me give you so I think this is pretty much what I've just said, but let me give you an idea of the objectives, and then I will present the teams such that you understand why I'm the only one talking today. So the objectives, I would say there are 3 types of objectives. The first one is to generate what I would call Victorian urban analytics. So urban analytics is a word just to say create data that allows to capture urban development, and Victorian because it would cover part of the Victorian period. And in order to do that, we need to clean census records and ordnance survey maps. So this is the first objective. The second one was to have a more narrative approach to this and to think about the reconstruction of stories and focusing on a few neighborhoods of Bristol, which are pretty much in the same part of Bristol. And the idea was here to discuss urban development or urban redevelopment. And the final point was to try to combine these 2 approaches to construct something that would look like an interactive map. This interactive map, there is a sort of template at the Bristol City Council. And so here it explains the team. The team is partly constituted of people doing Victorian urban analytics and partly constituted of people doing more narrative approaches to it, but also sharing those within the context of a website that is called Know Your Place. So that's it. Those are the 3 objectives. So shortly, the first objective, we are halfway. And because the rest depends partly on the first objective, that it means that I need to sort of finish the work on the first part for the rest to start making sense, which is why I'm talking today. Okay, so let me explain a bit. So the team it's a partnership between two teams, one at the University of Bristol and one at the Bristol City Council. And so we have on board Natalie, who is a computer scientist, Robert, who is an historian, and you may probably know. And on the Bristol City Council, we have Emma, who is a land contamination officer, but also a specialist in map at the Bristol City Council, and Peter, who is a historian and again specialized in map and urban development. And from Bristol, we don't start from scratch, because what you see here on the screen is I show you the raw maps, the ordnance survey maps of Bristol, but I also show you that we've already digitized both of, I have digitized part of it in a previous work. And the sort of weird polygons that you see is what Emma and Peter have been digitized. So we don't start from nothing. We already have some data on Bristol. However, as you can see, basically the underlying map contains much more than what we currently have. And so the idea basically would be to take those maps and take them not only as a cross-section, but take them as a time series, so over time, and try to digitize elements of the map in order to understand patterns of city development, these patterns being housing stock, how it looks like, amenities like churches, or workshop, like here you have the St. Philip's Mills. One of the reasons why we're interested in workshops or factories is because we are interested in pollution. So I don't know if you see here, but this is a chimney here. And we could digitize the industrial chimneys at the time. One of corollaries that we would be able to digitize pollution at the time and its evolution and how it affects neighborhood sorting over the very long run. So this is the purpose of the project. So let me first go through the first objective, the one in which I was telling you that we were halfway through. So the reason why we're halfway through is partly because of good news. So surprisingly, we got access to one thing that I don't think anyone got access to before, which is we have all the census records from 1851 to 1911, which is basically all census records that are actually available in the UK. So before 1851, you wouldn't have micro censuses. And after 1911, you wouldn't be able to actually look at it because of a 100-year period confidentiality or secrecy period. But we had access not only to the census records, but also to the names of people. And because we had access to the names of people, now there is one additional thing that we can use, is that we can link people across census waves. So it means that I would be able to observe Tim Cole in 1851, but also Tim Cole in 1861. So what is the advantage of observing Tim Cole in both census waves is because then you can observe what generates changes in neighborhood composition. So if you want to understand urban development, you want to understand why neighborhoods change or don't change. And one aspect is to understand where people come from. So for instance, were poor neighborhood in the east of Bristol becoming poor because of waves of migrants from rural areas arriving in the city and locating themselves here? Or was it neighborhood sorting at the level of the city without so much influence from what happens otherwise? This question that I'm asking here is a question that people don't have really answers to. And we don't have answers to it in Bristol, we don't have answers to it in London or in New York. It's just generally speaking a question that we can't answer. So where we are now is the following. Here I'm showing you matching across census waves. So it's a complicated process. So here it's the matching rate. So how many people we match. As you see, it's complicated because around 20 people get married, so we lose them, especially women. But also they migrate to other places like the US, so we lose them. And if you want to improve this picture here, you need to have let's say an algorithm that is very complicated and that is basically based on machine learning. So you input some information on TIMCO, like the age, where you're born, your name, and we try to match it with what happens in the future. Unfortunately, in between, there have been many mistakes because maybe Tim is not educated, and so when he's spelling his name, he's spelling it wrong half of the time. So this is part of the challenges that we're facing. So this data now is sort of available, and it's not only available for Bristol, it's available for the whole UK from 1851 to 1911. So this was the first challenge that we're facing. It's not yet completely clean, but it's sort of available. So if there are no questions on this thing, I will go to the second point. The second point that is about maps. So how did you learn about neighborhoods in the past? You can learn from census data, which is, let's say, the only source of decent data on residents, at least at the time. And the other source would be maps. So the maps, they look typically like the one that I show you above. So they look like this, these maps. These maps are not digitized. So it means they are scanned, but they're not digitized in a sense that the objects on the map are not recognized as objects. They're just like lines. And so what we need now to do is to extract features from these objects. So you see here, I show you a map of Burnley. And you see, let's imagine I want to extract some features of interest. So features of interest could be houses, these guys. It could be chimneys. Here you have one chimney, here another one, here another one. And it could be also the big workshops. I would like to take a look at the workshops. So what we've done so far is the following. In the context of these nice looking maps, I've managed to sort of classify roughly with errors some elements of the maps. So you see here, I show you an actual output. So you can see that you can see the errors, for instance. So you can see that some houses have not yet been identified as houses, and some other elements of the map look like they are not houses really. But here, it's unclear whether the algorithm would be able to tell. And look at the chimney. Here, the chimney, this is a chimney, this is a chimney, this is a chimney, this is an O, actually. So we are yet at the stage in which it needs to be cleaned, just such that you know these are fairly simple procedures, but they're simple in a sense that they're simple to implement, but they rely on fairly complicated coding, and they rely on deep learning procedure for many of them. So basically, it's a process that is still in progress. So this is what I've done. Finally, one last point about the maps and their digitization. I wanted also to capture the name of the workshops, because imagine that you're locating this guy. We would be happy to know that it's actually the old whole mill in Burnley and that it's a cotton mill. And in order to do that, you see the challenges here. Basically, this looks like old whole mill for us, but for a program, it's a bit noisy. And one part of the noise is, for instance, the angle. You see, this text is written with an angle, and so that the computer is completely unaware of capturing that. So basically, what I'm doing here is that I'm showing you a sort of optical character recognition when I don't turn the image around, and when I turn the image around by 10 degrees. And you see, in the first one in which I don't turn it around, it doesn't capture really well this name. However, it captured that there is a chimney. It just thinks that the chimney is called Lenny, which is quite cute. It's a cute name for a chimney, but so you see, I don't know why Lenny, but this is what the program is reading. And when I turn it by 10 degrees, then the chimney can't be recognized anymore. However, the old whole mill looks almost correct. You see? So how would it look a bit better? Well, if we were to complete the O, for instance, and blurring the image a bit, probably it would be able to recognize this cotton. So this is part of the work that remains to be done. So this is where we are now. We are constructing this output. It hasn't been constructed. So the two other objectives depend on this being done. So hopefully in the next few weeks, it will be done.
Great. Could I ask you just a little bit about the kind of COVID context? I guess for a lot of the work that you're doing, Yanos, COVID is irrelevant, because it's work that's digital. What about the kind of next phase where you're thinking much more about the kind of engagement with local communities? Have you thought a bit about how that'll play out?
Yeah, we thought about it. So there is even a student that we have who is called Giada, who is thinking about it and who made a suggestion. Some of these suggestions have sort of written them here. You made also a suggestion, Tim, in a previous discussion. So there are two problems here. The first problem is engagement and the collection of oral testimonies. Here, to be frank, it's quite unclear. We are yet at the stage in which we're unclear about what to do because of the following reason: people need to be engaged to provide stories, and online engagement is pretty unclear. So how would we be able, for instance, to provide data and make people excited enough, such as to share stories? That we are not yet clear. So in a sense, the question that we have now is what we would like to do, I think, is to create material of engagement from the data that we have now. So statistics and maps, visual objects that are where you can understand, for instance, how pollution affected Bristol in the past and how urban redevelopment changed it. But we are still a bit reliant on the degree to which we would be able to have face-to-face contact in the future. So we are thinking, I think, about contingency plans, but none of these plans are perfect in the sense that they would involve, I mean, we are not yet clear basically about how to engage people actively online. Do you see? Mm-hmm. So that's a bit, that's the issue that we have. So this is the first issue with the collection of oral testimony. The second issue is how do we want to adapt the output to COVID? And so, Tim, you made a suggestion. So I should have put you as part of the team, I guess. You made a suggestion that basically you said, tell me if I'm wrong, but you said during COVID, people are doing nothing. They're sort of baking banana bread and then they're having long walk in the city. And I don't know why you mentioned banana bread. It had nothing to do with MAPHIS. But in any case, the walks in cities had to do with MAPHIS. It was, you mentioned that maybe one way of doing that is that we could maybe try to exploit the new data that we would create and the testimonies and try, if possible, to combine that with walks, with historical walks in the city of Bristol. And we've discussed that with the team, and I think the Bristol City Council thought that it was Pete and Emma thought that it was a good idea. So Giada gave a serious thought about what would be possible or not to do. And let's say that we had ambitious plans about how to share the output of this story, either as an online support for where you walk to the city or as a physical one. So that's the idea. Here it's the opposite. It's like COVID has provided like an opportunity for us to rethink what we wanted to do. And maybe instead of just doing an online map in which you can have access if you click on the right link, maybe we could engage people more actively, basically.
Great. Fabulous. Thanks so much. What I'll do is at this point, let's see if there's any questions that have come in, which would be great to we'll just take a moment for any questions specific to Yanos's project, Yanos and team, and then what we'll do is we'll move over to the next project and we'll and then invite questions at the end. Robert has sent a message here saying map postcards of streets to send to people as we did in Wish You Were Here. This is what it was like. What do you know? What can you add? Which is a kind of good idea. I think there's a first project, one of the first Brigstow projects, this lovely project called Wish You Were Here, which worked with an amazing historical postcard collection within the city archives. And it was just, there's a kind of magic of getting those postcards back through your letterbox years later. A question from Steph. Have you thought about using linked QR codes on street panels to link into map data? So a kind of sense of putting the map data physically onto the street. Any thoughts on that? Yeah,
so Giada thought about it. She thought about it in two ways. So exactly the way Steph suggested, but also in another way in which they could even leave stories using the QR code. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
So for instance, you visit a place, you walk through a place, and then suddenly and you could use the QR code in order to leave a story, for instance, of the place, or a remark of your, or a comment or something like this. So this would be the ways maybe we could think about it. I have to say that I don't know. Pete was saying that they did it. They did it partly at the Bristol City Council already, for one thing. I don't know exactly how. So we will need to see. I don't know if, for instance, they use QR codes or something like this. But it's a good idea, especially because now people are super used to using these things.
Great, thanks, Yanos. We'll bring you back on in a moment. So we'll kind of bring you back on at the end with the other team, and we can have a longer kind of conversation.
Okay.
But for now, what I'll do is I'll pass over from Yanos to Laurence and to Liz and to Anne-Laure, and they're going to talk a little bit about their own project on making flood data more useful. And hopefully what you'll see in a moment is Laurence has this most beautiful flood warning sign background, which is better than Liz and my bookcases. There he is. He's just appeared. What I'll do is I'll just maybe ask you a couple of questions about the project, and then whoever, feel free to jump in as you wish. Could one of you or a couple of you just maybe introduce us a little bit, like Yanos did, to his project, just the kind of essential, I suppose, research questions, the kind of need for the project, the objectives, the things that you're trying to explore.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't mind doing that. So, hi everyone. My name's Laurence Hawker. I'm a postdoc at Bristol, as is Liz Haines, and Anne-Laure is also on the call here. She's working as an intern for us. So, essentially, the project is trying to link up we're trying to understand how can we make flood data more useful. So. I'm a physical scientist, and I produce lots of data which is useful to characterizing flooding. And this information is useful so we can prepare for flooding and ultimately reduce the number of fatalities. And the number of fatalities are disproportionately high in developing countries. So essentially, we are trying to understand the needs of the organizations that use flood data. And by organizations here, we mean kind of humanitarian organizations, disaster risk agencies, that sort of level of organizations. What they need from the data, and then essentially using that information to guide physical scientists into producing more useful flood information. So, in other words, we're trying to answer, what do organizations want from scientists? When do they want it? How should this be presented? So this is a very kind of complex question. First of all, we need to understand who these users are, and because they're a diverse group. They have NGOs, or lots of different types of organizations, but they also vary considerably throughout the world, and different people's understandings of risk, use of language, and how they visualize data and understand it. So that kind of led us on to essentially our aim is to produce an online survey to try to ask these questions, and this survey is also going to have a mapping component, so that's kind of where this mapping theme kind of comes into here. So at the overall plan is to produce this survey with this mapping component, which will be about 15-20 minutes, and this will be sent out to participants who work for humanitarian organizations, etc., in the developing world. And then we would collect these responses and produce a report and kind of present it at the sort of physical science conferences. So yeah, the plan was we were going to have quite a few workshops, because essentially when I kind of thought about this question about a year and a half ago, I was just coming from a physical science background, and I thought I kind of knew what organizations wanted, but actually I don't have a clue really, and we need to have social scientists come in to help make sure we're asking the right questions. So yeah, that's where we've got quite a diverse team. So I should say the rest of the team here, so we've got here on this call is from Bristol, and we've also got Sara from Oxford University, who's an anthropologist. We've got a few physical scientists based in Reading, Andrea Ficchi and Shaun Harrigan, who kind of work with forecasting data. And also in America, we have Beth Tellman and Emmalina and Glinkis, who work for kind of delivering these products and also user interaction.
Yeah, so I guess I suppose that what we're talking about, maybe I was just going to share an example of the kind of things which are currently distributed, because they're the kinds of material that Laurence is very used to and can read very easily, but I can't. And I can understand maybe in a slightly different way, and hopefully this is where the kind of collaboration is going, why people would find that difficult to read. But let me just see if I can bring one of those up. Yeah, so that's an example of a flood bulletin that was produced last year for the cyclones Idai and Kenneth in Mozambique. So a document like this, if you're in the middle of kind of trying to plan where to put resources, where to send people, it is quite difficult to read. And the issues around the reliability of the data or the confidence that the scientists have in the data is very difficult to express graphically. There's also there's also sort of lots of other reasons that this might not be a kind of immediately legible to lots of different people. So that was just to kind of give you an indication of what things look like, because we're not talking about maps sort of straightforwardly necessarily, but layers of data on maps, which is where it gets a bit more complicated.
Great. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've discovered so far? I don't know kind of how far along with the project you are, because I think there's something super interesting about this project about, in a sense, rather than the producer of the map framing what the map is, actually the consumers, the multiple consumers of the map framing. And I don't know if you've got a sense so far of what some of the needs of those different consumers or users, map users, I guess, and the ways in which map users think about ideas like risk or about data and what relevant data is and how to visualize risk and data.
So kind of the original plan when we set out this project, we're going to have a few workshops beforehand and trying to engage with a few stakeholders, also have a few online calls. But luckily we had over 100 hours of intern time now. So Anne-Laure on this call is an expert in interviews and kind of focus groups and running these sort of things. So what we're doing now is using some of her time to have in-depth interviews with between 8 and 10 participants to really improve our understanding of the questions we should be asking. So that's going to kind of lead into our designing our survey, which is, we've gone through a few iterations of it, but I feel these in-depth interviews will really help tie that down to make sure we're asking the right questions. And then we've also produced, so Natalie, I should also say, I forgot to mention her earlier, who's also working on Yanos' project. She's produced some great interactive maps. Essentially, we're going to ask participants what they prefer for these maps. So you have different base maps, for instance, which are the most legible to them. And then we have, currently displayed here, we have flood risk. So users can also change what colours they prefer. So at the moment, we've got like the classic traffic light system, which is generally favoured for maps, but for instance, not good for if you suffer from colour blindness. And just generally, what sort of information do people want? Do they care about health facilities, where the roads are, etc., etc. So we're really interested to understand if these preferences, if they change across groups and across organisations, geographical locations, kind of culture. There might not be a pattern at all, and it's just pure preference, or there might be a pattern we just don't really know. And this would be really key in helping to guide scientists in producing data, so we can kind of make sure is portrayed as legibly as possible. Kind of going back to Liz's example earlier.
One of the things that I found really interested in, kind of digging into some of the reports produced by reports and kind of projects produced by humanitarian organisations about this kind of thing, is that the sort of the ways in which particular kinds of information is used and circulated is quite various. So whilst things can be downloaded, it's also often necessary to be able to kind of print or photocopy them. The questions of the data availability, so whether people have access to good internet connections is a really important one, but also very different kinds of hybrid forms of data. So there's strong interest in people being able to integrate the information that they have from social media, for example, which are kind of giving live updates. So some kind of format which is able to which you're able to kind of annotate or add sort of live information on in particular kinds of way.
Can I ask you a little bit about the kind of COVID context and how, in whatever way, this has kind of changed things? And I don't know, Anne-Laure, if there's kind of ways in which that's inflected the kind of work that you're doing, which is more the kind of in-depth interviews. Maybe go to you first, but then I don't know, Laurence and Liz, if you've got any reflections on that. Then I'd like to ask you some questions about interdisciplinarity at the end. But I don't know if there's anything about this particular context that you've had to adapt to with the research.
At the moment, no, because the interviews will be done online or on the phone online. And then the survey is a survey, so that's an online survey. The one thing that has changed, and I'm sure my colleagues can say a bit more, is that what had been planned post-survey is a form of World Cafe, but bringing people in a room. So that has to be adapted to probably an online version of that. Mm-hmm. So this is what we've been having conversations about, because obviously, there's to and froing with ethics and what have you. So this is where we're at. So we've got a plan, and it's a canning plan.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear.
Well, this is it. You have to adapt. And I think, COVID is throwing up problems all over the place, but it's also forcing people to think differently about how you do these things.
I think we're also very lucky to have Anne-Laure, because her previous experience in qualitative research includes working online. So she has experience of doing research in online contexts, which we couldn't have predicted before we started this. So it's excellent to have Anne-Laure on board.
Yeah. So in some respects, we're always planning an online survey. So that kind of aspect hasn't changed, but we haven't been able to have the in-person meetings, which would have been really useful, and especially with kind of the stakeholders, people like MapAction, who are based in Oxford. And they were really, we've had a few online discussions, but it's just not the same as meeting in person.
So geography departments are famously divided often between physical geographers and human geographers. And I know, Liz, that you represent the latter, and Laurence, you represent the former in some ways. And I was wondering about your own reflections on working together on this project as a kind of this bigger interdisciplinary team, what you feel like you've learnt from each other, how it's shifted the project. I don't know also how you reflect back on your own disciplines or subdisciplines.
I think I've learned a lot personally. So this is the first time I've been involved in leading projects, so kind of on that side. Also, really basic things like ethics. Like I've never had to go through an ethics site before. I just didn't really know that really existed, and like the possibilities of like surveys and like focus groups. Like now I'll be way more comfortable with running a focus group. Because it's a bit of a sweeping statement, but physical scientists typically focus on just writing academic papers and not really other aspects of dissemination. And I felt working with Liz and the greater team, it's going to really help my understanding of what possibilities are and how you might essentially make the science more usable.
And I guess I feel like I've got to know quite a lot about, or a lot more than I did about mapping of floods and the use of different kinds of remote sensing data in that context. But I think also there is also a difference in my experience of kind of team working, I think that Laurence and his colleagues, for example, at Reading, are very used to collaborative work online, in fact, as part of their research process, which isn't something that I normally do. Almost all of my kind of research meetings and kind of key moments happen in physical meetings, whereas sort of using kind of Google Docs or kind of having kind of short meetings and sort of working online as a group is something that seems to be much more common to the physical scientists and the NGOs that we're working with, which has been really interesting. It's opened up the possibilities of, again, it's been interesting for me thinking about COVID-related research, like how kind of you can take those techniques and use them in other ways for social sciences and humanities research.
It's interesting that, I think, because in a sense, both of you pick up on the way that working with another sort of discipline or subdiscipline or set of approaches opens up a set of new methods that maybe aren't so central to the ways of working that you're used to. This kind of exposure to a set of different research methods, or ways of thinking about the world, or ways of kind of even like you said, Liz, the kind of nitty-gritty of actually how to collaborate, that suddenly there's a sort of a bringing together of things. Is there any way in which you've rethought the map at all through the process of kind of working together? I don't know, do you feel like even something as basic as a map, is that something that there's a shared understanding of, or have there been moments where you've kind of, I don't know, almost felt like you've thought about maps and mapping differently as a result of, I don't know, almost having to put yourself in the perspective of another discipline by dint of being in an interdisciplinary project, or having to put yourself in the kind of look at something from a different perspective because you're working in a co-produced ways with kind of end users, within, say, humanitarian organizations?
For me personally, I guess my area of expertise is in older maps, is in 20th century mapping. As a historian, that's where I work. So I'm very used to maps being drawn up in one particular way. So the data being kind of collected through measurement and then kind of drawn out in the ways you might kind of imagine topography. Whereas I think it's been more complicated for me to get used to thinking about the map as fundamentally as a data set and like just lots of data points organized and presented in a different way, which isn't how I usually think about maps. I mean, even when I'm using digital maps, I'm still thinking about them in a way as though they were produced by drawing lines rather than sort of through the sort of projection of all these different data points.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, when I did my MA a long time ago, and I was looking at a lot of 18th century Bristol and Bath maps at the time, and so for me they are more. It's a bit like, I was listening to Yanos, and I thought, yeah, this is what I understand, and suddenly didn't. I'm discovering a completely different way of looking and reading maps and reading those narratives, and that's really interesting because what I do for my PhD has got nothing to do with any of this, because I'm looking at political activation of women. But yeah, now I'm learning loads. I love it.
Laurence, anything from your perspective of working, kind of with sort of human geographers, social scientists? And also, I guess, with the NGOs, because I think they are really interesting, that this is a project that really involves end users, in a much more upfront way.
Yeah, it's just, I guess, it's the range of how people understand maps, and each person has quite different take on a map, and I kind of wasn't really aware of that, and also how someone feels like they have ownership of a map, if that makes sense. It sounds a bit obscure. If they can relate to it a bit more and have an ownership.
What we should do is let's move to some questions. And I noticed there's a question from Yanos, but rather than me reading out Janos's question, I think we should just get Yanos back to ask the question. So maybe, Kerry, if we can bring Yanos back in, and he had a question about the interactive map, but I think it's better if Yanos says that. And then I see there's a question coming from Karen for Yanos, which I'll read out in a moment. But Yanos, I don't know if you want to just ask your question or make the comments to Laurence, Liz, and Anne-Laure.
I thought that, you were thinking about sharing maps, and if I understand correctly, you want to ask people how to share those maps, no? Like in which format? Like how should the map look like?
Yeah, their cartographic preferences, really.
But Laurence, while you were going through your interactive maps, I was thinking that maybe one way of sharing it would be precisely to leave options to people. So share it in a way such that they could click on it. But there are two reasons for that. The first is that people, they may have different preferences. So some people may prefer to show cars and some people may not. But also just the principle of clicking on the thing. You see when you were clicking on the map, you were like making objects appearing. So it's more obvious to people that these objects are different. No, when you click on one and they disappear, and you click again and they reappear, then you understand what they are, like the roads. And I was wondering if it was also a possibility for you to ask them if such format would be useful, in a sense that people, they could have a format in which the map itself would be a series of options and they could play with it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're having in the survey. So it's going to have this interactive map, and they can have their record their preferences essentially. But also have to remember as well that a lot of these maps that are produced, they kind of have to be a static map, and like the GIS platforms are not. They're accessible to some end users, but not all of them. If you imagine, they need to like print out these maps and use them in the field. The map I've showed as well, that particular version doesn't have changing the colours and what have you yet. So it's going to be kind of an added layer of complexity to that. But we're getting there. The foundations are there.
Yeah, my question just I understand what you said, but my question was, can people, maybe people want to keep options. So this was my question, if you wish. So if I could export your map, I would like not to export it through what I've chosen, but I would like even to export it as with the options again open, such that I could click. You see, it seems to me like, imagine that you're a policymaker or a shareholder. It would be nice to have a discussion in which you show hospitals. And then I click on something and I say, yeah, but you see, the problem is that if we want to trace hospitals, then it means that we are forgetting part of the other economic activity. You see? So in a sense, I don't know if it's possible, but my feeling is that maybe people would like to have this choice also. So not for you just to share it as an end product and understand what the main end product would be, but if people value this option.
I think some of the work that we've been doing is trying to, what we're going to be looking at is seeing whether different groups of users have different sets of preferences. And one of that will be around what their bandwidth can support. So certainly some people in some places would probably prefer a map that with that kind of interactivity that they could use live. For other users who are maybe doing work more directly in the field, they really need basically a PNG file. That's all that they can really support to kind of be transmitted from mobile phone to mobile phone. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is isolate or try to understand like generally who are the users, and then try and kind of isolate different groups of users that might have different sort of technical support available to them and different technical expertise, to try and think about if we can't learn something about users in general, perhaps we can kind of learn something about how maps could be targeted better to different groups who are at work on those emergency relief efforts.
Great. I've got a question from Karen that's come in on the Q&A. It's for you, Yanos, and it's about a question of, have you contacted family history research groups? Might they be a way of finding people who could share oral histories or memories? Any kind of connection with family history, the kind of interest and craze in some ways for family history?
Yeah, so we thought about it a bit. So I have to say also that, I don't know if you see, but for instance, the census data, they're usually available through big websites to sort of track. So these guys, they buy sort of census data, they digitized it, and now they're making sort of money out of it. So in a sense, we've already been in contact with, let's say, the big guys that are like, more generally, what we had in mind, we had exactly what you said in mind, but not necessarily in the context of this specific project, but more generally, we had in mind the idea of trying to gather data through people that are interested in the history and possibly in the history of their family. The problem is the following, is that we can't really, I think, use census data to do that. So we can't use personal census data. So in order for people to be interested in something, maybe one thing that they would like is to have some information about their personal history, which is like where their parents were or their grandparents. And that the problem is that this data that we have it because we have the names of people. We can't really share it ourselves. It's part of what Ancestry has already. So we can engage with people, but we can't engage with their personal data. This is not something that we can share, for instance, in any way. So this is the problem. So then it restricts a bit the way we can gather it through the house of people. So if you live in your house, then maybe we can give some statistics about the previous owners of the house. But everything needs to be anonymized. That's the issue.
Yeah. Another question for you, Yanos, from Steph. What mechanisms will you use, if any, for linking the census, i.e. the human data, with the map data? Will the end product allow interrogation of the maps to identify individuals or groups with locations? And I guess it's almost about the two objectives, the two different parts of the project, the census data part and then the extracting from the maps. Is there any link between the two? Will there be any link between the two?
There is a link, actually. I haven't said it, but in part of a previous project, what we did was to develop an algorithm in order to geolocate people. So it means that people in the census records, we would be able to tell where they live. So if you wish, think about the map, it means that we would know where the people in the census records live. And just to give you an idea of what we did, because I think it has an intuitive aspect, in general, it's very difficult to geolocate people because they give noisy addresses. Mm-hmm. However, on the census day, they would visit places. One enumerator would visit a block. So it means that if I'm able to geolocate Laurence and Liz, and then there are 5 people in between that I can't geolocate, you can sort of see where they are just through the sort of logical pattern in the census books. So this is what we did in the past. So how do we link the census and the maps? We link them geographically. So we're able to locate people at the block level and the maps as well. So this is how we combine the two. We combine the two together.
Great. And then a question from Gail. Are there any insights in terms of the historic maps, Yanos, which also may be about future development? So I don't know how, in some ways, by learning about the way that a neighborhood has developed in the past, is there anything that it feeds through into kind of debates around planning and future development of neighborhoods?
So yes, so the insight that we will gain from this project, I don't know yet. However, I can give you an insight from a previous project. So in a previous project, which this project relies upon, we showed that basically the west-east pattern that you see in industrial cities, in industrial cities, comes from pollution in the past. Mm-hmm. So what happened was the following: you had pollution arriving with coal burning technology. And then you had neighborhood sorting happening with rich people escaping towards the west of cities and poor people living in the east side of cities. And this process has been extremely persistent because in the UK, pollution has disappeared. Pollution of this sort has disappeared from the center of cities in the past 40 or 50 years. And yet you can still observe that this part of city is the poor part. So this is what and of course it has an impact. Knowing that means that any environmental disamenity that you have nowadays that would create a special heterogeneity or inequality would have very long-term consequences on the structure of cities. So planners, they should know it. Whether they want to do something about it, it's up to them, but they should know that it has consequences.
Yeah.
So, and there are costly redevelopment, but these costly redevelopment are fairly hard, are not always successful. So if you want London, for instance, or currently the docks in Manchester or in Bristol are success stories, but there are a lot of non-success stories at the same time.
Great. Liz, I think you've got a question about machine learning and maps.
Yes, and I'm not sure how well put this question is going to be. I guess it seems to me that my experience in my small experience in machine learning is that it can mean quite a lot of different things. And I wondered, I wasn't totally sure that I understood how your machine learning is taking place. So is it correct that you are, so it's looking at the maps and identifying objects on the maps, and you are manually correcting, and then it takes those corrections into account when it processes new data? Is that might be a really totally incorrect characterization of how it's working.
So I don't know if it's useful, but I will try to. So my interpretation of machine learning is that it's prediction. So machine learning is typically isolating data points and saying which is red and which is blue. So these data points, they could take several forms. They could be like data, like a line of data, but they could be also a polygon or an image or a video. And in a sense here, what it's doing, machine learning, is really like taking these features that we, first it's helping recognize, to be frank, features. So this polygonization that I've shown you, it helps in recognizing a polygon. So, but then what it does mostly is it take a look at the polygon and it sort of classifies it. Is it a house? Does it look like a chimney? And typically think of it as really prediction. So it means that somebody could help by saying, by providing a training sample. So you, for instance, you would look at different maps. I would show you maps and you would say, this is a chimney, this is a workshop, this is a house. We take this data and we show it to the computer, and the computer sees what you do. It sees what you've observed and what you do, and it tries to replicate it. So if you want, in this case, it's sort of baseline machine learning in a sense that it's really a prediction object. So think really about the polygon as data points, and then it sees them and classify them between red, blue, and green. This is really what it's doing, if that helps.
No, that's great. I guess because I've been involved before now in projects where the absence of maps in developing countries. So for example, there's an organization run by Médecins Sans Frontières, which missing maps, where they work, but where humans kind of come together and crowdsource ways to use aerial or remote sensing data to kind of map onto like where are houses, where are streets, onto areas which can be seen from satellites but aren't in any kind of map. So they turn them into data sets that can be used for epidemiology and so on. So so presumably you could also use crowdsourcing in a way, or they are probably also developing machine learning to do similar kinds of, but it's the same kind of activity.
It's the same kind of activity. So if you think about it, your guys, they've been useful to classify pixels, sort of in a satellite imagery. So they're like, okay, this is a house. And this is how they inform possibly a machine learning algorithm to recognize what they are, these things in general. Are they houses in general? Here it's exactly the same, except that the initial support is a bit different. So instead of being a satellite image that has colors and that has maybe even bands that you don't observe, like infrared or something like this. Here, just what I've shown you. So it's just like a simple image. But here, similarly, people could be useful in a sense that if people were to help us and to say, oh, this is a chimney. I don't know why they would do that, but if they're happy doing that, it would be very useful to us. So it would be very useful. This would be a way, for instance, of using crowdsourcing, for instance. Absolutely. But what you say with satellite is something that Laurence, I guess, here is fairly used to. And this is a very, very standard application of visual recognition with maps. So what we do with these historical maps is a bit less standard. What you've just said is much more standard, much well developed.
So I guess I wondered whether that would be a component that was possible. I mean, it sounds like you've got lots on your plate, but people, for example, who can't currently visit with Bristol archives but are enthusiasts in family history or railway history might be interested in participating in doing that kind of crowdsourced work on your documents at the moment.
That would be great. What we wanted also to do is to actually, it was a project that we had for a while with a friend of mine, which was to try to use these historical maps to gain insights about stuff. So basically, we'd show the historical maps and people would recognize their house now and say something and add information that they know. So this is something that we had in mind. To be frank, we haven't yet developed it, but I was thinking precisely on this project as a platform to think about something of the sort. So because this project, the output would be Pete and Emma helping in designing an interactive map about Bristol. This could be a way of trying to gather that. And what you say could be actually something that we even do in the context of this project. So it's a very good idea. and we don't know how much we can rely on these nerdy people that are interested in family history and who have lots of information.
Well, the city archives have lots of volunteers who normally go every week to do work in the archives and currently won't be able to do their volunteering work. So there might be people ready and waiting.
Well, so I would be happy to contact them.
I can put you in touch with some of the archivists. Well, or Pete can put you in touch, certainly, with the archivists. But yeah. Yeah,
and Robert just added a note on the chat about how the Ramblers Association apparently did this with a kind of sort of crowdsourced mapping of rambling routes, and it was immensely popular, like a huge and extraordinary take-up of people who were, really happy to identify lost footpaths, and in a sense to kind of put them back on the map. These footpaths that have sort of disappeared from the map to be put back on the map. Which he's adding an extra chat which relied on local knowledge very much. Thank you, everyone. I think what I think is super interesting about both these projects is that I feel like there's quite a lot of similarities in some ways between them in terms of this sort of the map as a kind of the maps are things that are produced and used, but in some ways I think both of the projects are in some ways are kind of turning those on their head or kind of using maps for different purposes. Like as Liz knows, Liz is an expert on all of this. There's a kind of a critical geography literature about the relationship between mapping and power. That mapping is always about the way in which power is exercised over space and place. And I think there's something really interesting about both projects that in some ways does something about subverting that in subtle ways or kind of reframing power, and that responds, I think, in some ways to the kind of critique of the map as a very much about, say, colonial mapping as a way of exercising colonial power, or even mapping in a British context, I think, as about the exercise of power over place by the state. And I think there's something interesting about both these projects where users are brought in much earlier on, or they're brought in different ways, or crowdsourced, or the map itself is subverted in some ways, and that it's not necessarily used for what it was originally intended for, but goes through a sort of process of reuse. So many thanks to all of you for your contributions, and thanks for introducing us to two really fascinating projects that we look forward to hearing more about. Maybe we'll try and persuade you to come back together 6 months or so down the line and fill us in on the next sort of stage of the project. But for now, thank you, everyone, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye now.
Yeah, thanks, everyone, and have a nice weekend.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.